After the accident left me in a wheelchair, my brother convinced my wife to sign over our house. He'll never recover anyway. They thought I couldn't hear from my hospital bed. 6 months later, I showed up at their housewarming party. I'm not sure where to begin with. I guess I should start by saying that I never thought my own brother and wife could do what they did. Maybe that's naive of me. Probably is. I've always been the trusting type, which Sebastian used to say was my biggest weakness. Turns out he was right about that. Like he was about most things. The accident happened on a Tuesday. I remember that much. We were finishing up a 3-story office renovation, and I was checking some electrical work on the second floor. I've always been hands-on with my business, probably why we never grew as big as we could have. Sebastian always said I needed to delegate more, to think bigger. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have been standing under that support beam when it gave way. I don't remember much about the fall itself, just a cracking sound, then nothing. The doctors told me later that I landed on a stack of materials that prevented the impact from killing me outright. But the damage to my spine was severe. T10 complete injury. That's what they call it in the medical reports. What it means in real life is that I'll never walk again. Everything from the waist down, gone forever. The first few weeks after the accident are mostly a blur of pain medication, surgeries, and infection. I drifted in and out of consciousness. Elizabeth was there a lot at first. I remember her tearful face, her hand squeezing mine. She'd bring fresh clothes and run her fingers through my hair, telling me everything would be okay, that we'd figure it out together. Sebastian came too, his visits always overlapping with hers. He'd stand behind her, hand on her shoulder, looking down at me with what I thought was concern. I guess I should tell you a bit about my brother and me. Sebastian has always been the golden child, 2 years older, always taller, better looking, more charismatic. Growing up, whatever I did, he did better. When I made the baseball team, he was captain. When I brought home B's, he brought home A's. Our parents never explicitly compared us, but they didn't need to. The comparison was implied in every proud smile they gave him. In high school, Sebastian dated the girl I'd had a crush on for months after she confided in him about my feelings. In college, he got the internship I'd applied for because his application was more impressive. When I started my construction business, Sebastian told everyone at Thanksgiving dinner that it was cute I was playing with tools while he was climbing the corporate ladder. Meeting Elizabeth was the first time I'd ever felt like I'd won something Sebastian couldn't take away. She was beautiful, smart, and for some reason I'll never understand, she chose me. We met at a client's office where she worked as a receptionist. I was installing new windows, and I dropped a hammer near her desk. I apologized profusely, probably too much, as usual, and she laughed instead of getting annoyed. We were married 18 months later. Sebastian came to the wedding alone, despite always having a girlfriend. He gave a toast that somehow managed to be about him while congratulating us. Elizabeth thought it was funny. I laughed along, too, like I always did at Sebastian's jokes at my expense. I was used to it by then, I guess. When we bought our house, Sebastian asked why we'd chosen such a modest place, when we could have stretched our budget for something more impressive. I explained that we wanted to renovate it ourselves, make it our own over time. He nodded like he understood, but the look he gave Elizabeth said, "You could have done better." Despite Sebastian's constant undermining, the business grew steadily. Nothing explosive, but solid. We specialized in commercial renovation, and I built a reputation for reliability and quality work. Elizabeth supported me through the early years, when I was working 70-hour weeks to establish myself. Sebastian would occasionally refer clients to me, always with the caveat that his little brother's outfit was small but competent, and then expect eternal gratitude for his generosity. Sorry, I'm rambling about the past, when I should be getting to what happened in the hospital. About 4 weeks after the accident, when the doctors had stabilized me and my long-term prognosis became clear, I started noticing changes in Elizabeth's behavior. Her visits became shorter, less frequent. She seemed distracted, often checking her phone. She'd bring things I needed, toiletries, comfortable clothes for physical therapy. But the emotional warmth was fading. Sebastian, on the other hand, was becoming more present. He'd arrived before Elizabeth, stay after she left. I noticed him walking her to her car, their heads bent together in conversation. At first, I thought he was just being supportive, helping her cope with the shock of her husband becoming disabled overnight. I was even grateful. Then came the day that changed everything. I'd been having a particularly rough morning with pain management. The nurse had given me something stronger than usual, and it knocked me out completely. I woke up slowly, groggily, to the sound of hushed voices. Elizabeth and Sebastian were in my room, standing near the window. They didn't realize I was awake because my eyes were only slightly open, and the medication had left me completely still. That's when I heard it. Sebastian was telling Elizabeth that she needed to be realistic about my condition. He said the doctors had told him, which was a lie, they would only speak directly to Elizabeth about my prognosis, that my chances of any meaningful recovery were minimal, that I would likely need full-time care indefinitely, that the medical bills would bankrupt us if we didn't make strategic decisions now. Elizabeth was crying softly, saying she couldn't abandon me. Sebastian's voice was gentle but insistent, as he explained that it wasn't abandonment, it was pragmatic planning. He suggested that she should transfer the house into her name only, to protect it from medical creditors, that my business would need proper management during my absence, which he was willing to provide, that the stress of maintaining our life together while caring for me would destroy her. I wanted to scream, to sit up and tell them both to get out, but my body wouldn't respond. The medication had me completely paralyzed, a cruel irony given my actual paralysis. So I lay there, eyes barely cracked open, listening to my brother convince my wife that I was essentially already gone. Over the next 2 weeks, I started pretending. When they were around, I'd act more sedated than I was. I'd slur my words, drift off mid-sentence, stare vacantly. The doctors were puzzled by my apparent cognitive decline, but I made sure to be alert and engaged during my examination when Elizabeth and Sebastian weren't present. It was exhausting maintaining the deception, but it worked. They began speaking more freely around me, assuming I couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. That's how I learned about the affair. It hadn't started after my accident, as I might have forgiven, given the circumstances. No, from their unguarded conversations, I pieced together that it had been going on for at least a year. Sebastian would reminisce about their weekend together at the lake house last summer, when I was at that construction conference in Denver. Elizabeth would shush him, glancing nervously at my supposedly vacant expression, but she never denied it. I also discovered that Sebastian had been embezzling from my company for months. He'd convinced Elizabeth to give him signatory authority on the business accounts for emergency situations. While I was recovering from the initial surgeries, he'd been systematically diverting funds, claiming to our employees that projects were under budget, or that clients had renegotiated terms. The final blow came about 6 weeks after the accident. Elizabeth came alone, which had become rare. She sat beside my bed, holding my limp hand, and told my supposedly uncomprehending mind that she'd signed the paperwork to transfer our house solely into her name. She cried as she explained that it was for the best, that the medical bills would otherwise take everything we'd built together, that she'd always make sure I was cared for, but that she needed to protect herself too. That night, after everyone had gone, I finally allowed myself to break down. The night nurse found me sobbing silently, my body shaking with the effort of keeping my cries quiet. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with kind eyes. Susan was her name. She didn't ask questions, just sat with me, offered tissues, and waited. When I could finally speak, it all poured out. Everything I'd heard, the betrayal, the helplessness. Susan listened without judgment, then said something that changed everything. "You know, you don't have to just take this." That simple statement hit me like a bucket of cold water. My whole life, I'd just taken whatever Sebastian dished out. I'd smiled through his backhanded compliment, accepted his constant one-upmanship, even laughed when he flirted with my wife at our own wedding reception. I'd spent 37 years being the bigger person, turning the other cheek, keeping the peace. And where had it gotten me? Paralyzed, betrayed, and about to be homeless. The next morning, with Susan's help, I asked to use the phone for a private call to arrange my affairs. The nursing staff, sympathetic to my condition, left me alone in my room. I called Brody, my most trusted employee, and the closest thing I had to a friend. Brody had been trying to visit for weeks, but Sebastian had told him I wasn't ready for visitors, that it would be too upsetting in my fragile state. Brody answered on the second ring. I still remember the shock in his voice when I spoke clearly, coherently, explaining what I needed from him. I asked him to come to the hospital that night, after visiting hours, and to tell no one he was coming. Susan had agreed to let him in through a side entrance used by staff. That evening, Brody sat beside my bed as I outlined everything I'd learned. His face grew darker with each revelation. When I finished, he didn't offer empty sympathies or suggest forgiveness. Instead, he asked one simple question: "What do you want to do about it?" For the first time since the accident, I felt a sense of purpose cutting through the fog of betrayal and self-pity. "I want to take everything back," I told him. "And then, I want to take everything they have." Brody nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Then we'd better get started." Over the next few days, with Brody's help, I began gathering information. He brought me copies of business records, bank statements, and project files. Susan helped me hide these materials during the day and brought them back out when I was alone at night. Through Brody, I made contact with Lyric, an attorney who specialized in fraud cases. She agreed to visit me disguised as a physical therapist to avoid alerting Sebastian or Elizabeth. Meanwhile, I continued my act when they visited. I'd grown quite convincing at appearing mentally foggy and physically helpless. Sebastian had become so confident in my incapacity that he once took a business call in my room, discussing how he planned to liquidate company assets for a much-needed vacation once the paperwork went through. Elizabeth's visits grew even less frequent. When she did come, she'd sit quietly, sometimes reading aloud from magazines as if fulfilling an obligation. Once she brought me soup from our favorite restaurant, a small kindness that made the betrayal even more painful. She still wore her wedding ring, but I noticed she twisted it nervously whenever Sebastian entered the room. One evening, I overheard them in the hallway outside my room. They were discussing renovations to the house, my house. Sebastian was describing how they'd tear down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, something Elizabeth and I had disagreed about for years. He talked about the housewarming party they'd have once the renovations were complete. Elizabeth hesitated, saying it might be too soon, that people would talk. Sebastian dismissed her concerns, saying everyone would understand given the circumstances. That night, as Susan helped me with my physical therapy exercises that no one knew I was doing, I made a decision. I wouldn't just reclaim what was rightfully mine. I wouldn't just expose their betrayal. I would wait until their renovation was complete. I would wait until their housewarming party, when they were surrounded by friends and colleagues, feeling secure in their new life, built on the ruins of mine. And then I would show them exactly what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. The next morning, I asked Brody to find me an apartment near my former home, somewhere I could recover privately once I was discharged, somewhere I could watch them while making my preparation. Lyric began reviewing options for legal action, focusing on the fraudulent transfer of property and business assets. For the first time since the accident, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for my condition. The wheelchair that would be my lifelong companion would also be the perfect misdirection. Who would suspect the broken man, with the sad eyes of plotting their complete destruction? I'd spent my whole life being overlooked, underestimated, and pushed aside. Sebastian had always counted on my tendency to back down, to accept less than I deserved. Elizabeth had obviously mistaken my generosity for weakness, my trust for blindness. Their mistake, their last mistake. Now I just had to be patient for a little longer. The housewarming party would come, and with it, my moment. I drifted off to sleep that night, not with despair, but with the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. They thought they'd buried me. They didn't realize they'd planted a seed. Update. First, thank you all for the supportive comments on my last post. I didn't expect so many people to connect with my story. Several of you asked about my recovery, and how I managed to plan everything while still in the hospital. This update should answer those questions. 3 weeks after I enlisted Brody's help, I was discharged to a rehabilitation facility. Sebastian and Elizabeth visited on transfer day, making a show of concern for the staff. I maintained my act of being mentally foggy and physically helpless. Elizabeth had brought a small plant for my new room, a peace lily that would apparently thrive even with minimal care. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Low maintenance, just like she wanted me to be. Sebastian spent most of the visit talking to the staff about my limited capabilities and asking about power of attorney documentation. The rehabilitation coordinator seemed uncomfortable with his question, especially when he implied that I couldn't make decisions for myself. I remember staring vacantly at the wall while mentally cataloging every word, every presumption, fuel for what was coming. The rehabilitation center was where I began my real recovery, both physical and strategic. With Susan's recommendation, I was assigned to Ramon, a physical therapist who had worked with spinal injury patients for over a decade. During our first private session, I dropped the act and explained my situation. Ramon didn't judge me for planning revenge instead of acceptance. He simply nodded and said people cope in different ways, then outlined a rigorous rehabilitation program that would maximize my independence. Every morning I worked with Ramon on strengthening my upper body, learning transfer techniques, and adapting to life in a wheelchair. The pain was excruciating at first. My arms trembled from the effort of pulling my dead-weight lower body around. Calluses formed on my palms, then broke open and bled. I'd collapse into bed each night, physically shattered, but mentally more determined than ever. When Sebastian or Elizabeth visited, increasingly rare occurrences, I'd downplay my progress dramatically. I'd slump in my chair, fumble basic tasks, and respond with one-word answer. Sebastian seemed relieved at my apparent decline. Elizabeth showed flashes of guilt, but they never lasted long, especially when Sebastian was there to remind her they were doing what's best for everyone. Meanwhile, Brody had become my eyes and ears in the outside world. He'd visit after hours, bringing reports about the business and updates on Sebastian and Elizabeth's activity. The news was worse than I'd imagined. Sebastian had moved into our house 2 weeks after my transfer to rehab. He was sleeping in my bed, wearing my clothes, driving my car. Elizabeth had redecorated my home office into a meditation space, something she'd always wanted, but I'd resisted. Brody also confirmed my suspicions about the business. Sebastian had convinced 3 major clients to renegotiate their contracts, claiming financial hardship due to my accident. The money difference went straight into a new account that only Sebastian could access. He'd laid off 2 long-term employees who were loyal to me, replacing them with friends who wouldn't question his authority. My company was being systematically gutted, and he was doing it all under the guise of managing things until Logan recovers. Each new piece of information should have hurt, but something strange was happening to me. The more I learned, the less I felt. It was like watching a movie about someone else's life being destroyed. The emotional disconnection worried me at first. Was I having some kind of psychological breakdown? But Ramon explained it was a common protection mechanism. My mind was shielding me from pain that might interfere with what needed to be done. By the 3rd month of rehabilitation, I had mastered basic wheelchair skills and was working with Lyric to build our legal strategy. We identified 3 main targets: the fraudulent property transfer, the business embezzlement, and the breach of fiduciary duty. Lyric discovered that the document Elizabeth had signed transferring the house had several critical flaws. Sebastian, in his arrogance, had rushed the process and made mistakes we could exploit. I also made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing old business records Brody had smuggled to me, I found evidence that Sebastian had been siphoning money from my company for much longer than we thought. Almost 2 years. Small amounts at first, then growing bolder. I remembered Elizabeth's sudden interest in expensive handbags around that time, the weekend trips they'd take when I was busy with work, all paid for with my money. All while I worked 70-hour weeks to grow the business. The revelation crystallized something in me. This wasn't opportunistic betrayal after my accident. This was the culmination of a long-planned takeover. They had been waiting for the right moment, and the accident just accelerated their timeline. My paraplegia wasn't the cause of their betrayal. It was simply convenient. With that understanding, my approach shifted. I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine anymore. I was dismantling everything they had built together and separately. I wanted total destruction, complete ruination, the kind of devastation from which there is no recovery. Lyric introduced me to Maya, a financial investigator who specialized in finding hidden assets. Maya was ruthless, methodical, and seemed to take personal offense at what Sebastian and Elizabeth were doing. Within weeks, she had mapped out Sebastian's entire financial structure, including offshore accounts he thought were untraceable, and investments made under a cousin's name. She also discovered Elizabeth had been setting aside money in a private account for over a year, preparing her escape fund long before my accident. By month 4, I had created a new shell company with Brody as the public face. Through this entity, we began strategically acquiring debts related to Sebastian's personal finances. His car loan, credit card debt, even the mortgage on a small vacation property he'd recently purchased, all now effectively owned by me. Sebastian had no idea that when the time came, all these debts would be called simultaneously. I also reconnected with old clients through Brody, explaining my situation and Sebastian's fraud. Most were horrified and agreed to provide statements about how Sebastian had misrepresented my condition to manipulate their contract. 2 even offered to rehire my company once I was back in control, which gave me a strange feeling, part gratitude, part grim satisfaction, that Sebastian's betrayal would ultimately strengthen my business relationships. My physical recovery continued to exceed expectations. Ramon pushed me harder than the standard protocols, recognizing my determination as therapeutic in itself. By month 5, I could transfer independently from wheelchair to bed, toilet, shower, and car. I could push myself up modest ramps, navigate curbs, and manage most daily activities without assistance. My upper body had transformed, my shoulders and arms now corded with muscle from constant wheelchair use. The rehab center began discussing discharge plans. This presented a new challenge. Sebastian and Elizabeth expected me to transfer to a long-term care facility where they could visit occasionally and maintain their supportive family facade. Instead, I arranged for Brody to sign a lease on an apartment just 3 blocks from my former home. Ramon helped certify me for independent living, and we scheduled my discharge for a Tuesday when Sebastian would be at a regional business meeting. The day I left rehab was surreal. I'd spent nearly 5 months there, longer than most patients with my injury level. The staff had become something like family, the only people besides Brody, Lyric, and Maya who knew my true capabilities and plans. Susan even drove down from the hospital for my discharge, bringing a card signed by nurses who had helped me in those early days. Elizabeth came alone to collect my personal items, expecting to drive them to the care facility. Her shock when I met her in the lobby, sitting upright in my wheelchair with discharge papers for a private apartment, was the first real satisfaction I'd felt in months. I maintained my emotionally distant act, but allowed myself to demonstrate more physical capability than she'd previously seen. The confusion on her face as I efficiently packed my own bag, declined her help, and mentioned that a friend would be driving me to my new place. It was all worth the months of hiding my progress. Brody arrived right on cue, greeting Elizabeth with cold politeness before helping load my belongings into his car. Elizabeth hovered awkwardly, caught between maintaining her caring wife persona for the rehab staff and processing what my newfound independence might mean for her and Sebastian's plans. She tried to get my new address, claiming she'd want to visit, but I deflected, saying the facility would forward any mail. As Brody drove me away, I watched her in the side mirror, phone already pressed to her ear, undoubtedly calling Sebastian with the alarming news. My new apartment was small but fully accessible. Brody had installed grab bars in the bathroom, lowered key shelves, and arranged furniture for wheelchair navigation. Most importantly, It had a clear view of the street leading to my former house. From my living room window, I could watch Sebastian and Elizabeth come and go, observe deliveries of renovation materials, and monitor their visitors. The first night alone in my apartment, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and power. My body was forever changed, limited in ways I was still discovering daily. Simple tasks like showering or cooking had become complex operations requiring planning and specialized equipment. Yet, mentally, I had never felt more focused, more capable of calculated action. Over the next few weeks, I established a routine: mornings for physical training, afternoons for work with Lyric and Maya on the legal strategy, evenings for surveillance. Brody installed discrete cameras around my former property's perimeter, all on public land, all completely legal. Through these, I watched my home transform under Sebastian and Elizabeth's renovations. They tore out the kitchen I had renovated myself as a first-year anniversary gift to Elizabeth. They painted over the nursery we had prepared years ago. In the brief time we thought Elizabeth was pregnant before the devastating miscarriage, they replaced the handcrafted front door I'd built from reclaimed wood with something modern and impersonal. Each change was like watching them erase evidence that I had ever existed there. Through our surveillance, we learned they were planning a housewarming party for exactly 6 months after my accident. Sebastian had invited business associates, neighbors, and mutual friends. The invitation described the event as a fresh start celebration and included a note about making donations to a spinal injury charity in honor of Elizabeth's former husband, as if I were already dead. The party planning gave us our deadline. Maya accelerated her financial investigations, uncovering that Sebastian had taken loans against my business assets to fund the extensive home renovations. Lyric prepared multiple legal filings, all ready to be submitted simultaneously for maximum impact. Brody cultivated relationships with former employees who had been mistreated by Sebastian, gathering additional statements and evidence. 2 weeks before the housewarming, I received unexpected news that slotted the final piece into place. A former client contacted Brody to say that Sebastian had been using substandard materials on projects while charging premium prices. The client had discovered this during an independent inspection and was preparing to sue. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to trigger regulatory investigations into the business practices under Sebastian's management. With this final piece of information, my plan was complete. I spent the days before the party rehearsing every detail, anticipating every possible reaction, and preparing countermeasures for any resistance. Ramon helped me select and customize a wheelchair that balanced functionality with appearance. I wanted to look capable, not pitiable, when I made my entrance. The night before the party, I sat by my window watching delivery trucks bring catering supplies, furniture, and decorations to my former home. Lights blazed late into the night as Sebastian and Elizabeth prepared for their social debut as a couple. From my darkened apartment, I could see them moving together through the house, stopping occasionally to embrace or admire their handiwork. They looked happy, content, secure in their belief that they had gotten away with everything. I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was something colder, more focused. A surgeon doesn't feel rage toward the cancer they're about to remove. They simply identify it, isolate it, and cut it out with precision. Tomorrow, I would excise Sebastian and Elizabeth from my life with the same clinical efficiency. As I prepared for bed that final night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at me was almost unrecognizable from the person I'd been before the accident. Physically, yes, the wheelchair, the transformed upper body, the new hardness in my expression, but the deeper change was in my eyes. The old Logan, the one who had spent a lifetime accommodating Sebastian's ego and ignoring warning signs about Elizabeth, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone forged in betrayal and tempered by pain. Tomorrow, Sebastian and Elizabeth would meet this new person for the first time, and it would be the last thing they would ever see coming. I set my alarm, checked my preparations one final time, and went to sleep with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what the next day will bring. Update 2. The morning of the housewarming party, I woke before my alarm. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of my accessible apartment, listening to the sounds of a Saturday morning distant lawn mower. Children playing, normal life continuing, while I prepared to dismantle two people's entire existence. I felt oddly calm, like a storm that had finished gathering and was now simply waiting to make landfall. I followed my morning routine meticulously, stretching, transferring to my wheelchair, showering with the specialized equipment that had become second nature after months of practice. As I dressed in the charcoal suit I'd had tailored to fit my seated form, I caught myself thinking about how Elizabeth had always liked me in gray. The thought came without pain now, just observation. The emotional connections had been surgically severed, leaving only clear purpose. Brody arrived at noon, bringing the final documents from Lyric and updates from Maya. Everything was in place. The legal filings were prepared with multiple copies. Financial triggers were set to activate with a single phone call. Law enforcement had been quietly briefed about potential fraud charges. Even the weather was cooperating. A clear, mild evening, perfect for the outdoor portion of the party. Sebastian and Elizabeth had planned, in the backyard I'd landscaped myself years ago. The hours before the party passed in focused preparation. Brody reviewed our timeline once more while I checked my appearance. The wheelchair I'd selected was understated but high quality, with minimal medical features. I wanted to present strength, not invite pity. I'd grown a short, neatly trimmed beard during my recovery that changed my appearance enough to give me a psychological edge. Even my posture had transformed, the perpetual slouch of someone always trying to avoid attention replaced by the straight-backed confidence of a man with nothing left to lose. At 5:30 p.m., we watched through our surveillance as the first guests arrived. Sebastian greeted them at the door, my door, wearing a designer shirt I'd never been able to afford. Elizabeth appeared moments later in a dress I recognized from our 5th anniversary dinner. They looked confident, established, as if the house had always been theirs alone. Cars continued to arrive, filling the driveway and lining the street. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, all people who believed whatever story Sebastian and Elizabeth had told them about my condition and absence. We waited until 7:15 p.m. when the party would be in full swing. Brody drove me the 3 blocks to my former home, parking directly in front of the house rather than down the street, as others had done. As he unloaded my wheelchair, I noticed curtains twitching in neighboring windows, the first audience members taking their seats for the show that was about to begin. The front walk to my house had new pavers, wider than the original path, ironically more accessible for my wheelchair. Music and conversation spilled from the open windows. I could hear laughter, glasses clinking, the murmur of comfortable social exchange. Brody walked slightly behind me as I pushed myself up the gentle slope to the front door, legal briefcase secured to the back of my chair. I didn't knock. The door was unlocked, as it always was during parties at my house. I simply pushed it open and rolled inside. The entrance opened directly into the large living room, where about 30 people stood in clusters, drinks in hand. The renovation had removed the wall separating it from the dining area, creating an open concept space that flowed toward the kitchen. It looked like a magazine spread stylish, impersonal, with no trace of my existence except the structural bones of the house itself. The conversations nearest the door stopped first, then silence spread outward like ripples in water. I scanned the room until I found them, Sebastian and Elizabeth standing near the kitchen island, momentarily unaware of the disruption, as they laughed with a small group of admirers. Then Sebastian glanced towards the sudden quiet and saw me. The glass he was holding slipped from his hand, shattering on the new hardwood floors. Elizabeth turned to follow his gaze, her smile freezing, then collapsing as the color drained from her face. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then Sebastian recovered, plastering on a smile as he started moving toward me, no doubt preparing to spin this as a heartwarming surprise visit from his recovering brother. I didn't give him the chance. I wheeled forward into the center of the room, Brody flanking me, and removed a microphone from my jacket pocket. unnecessary in the silence but theatrically effective. In a clear, steady voice that betrayed no emotion, I welcomed everyone to my home and apologized for not being able to send proper invitations, as I hadn't been informed of the event happening in my own house. The confused murmurs began immediately. People looked between me and Sebastian, trying to understand. Sebastian hurried forward, still trying to control the narrative, making some comment about being so happy I could join them, and how they'd been supporting me through my recovery. His voice had the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through sheer confidence. That's when I played the first recording. From a small speaker attached to my wheelchair came Sebastian's voice from the hospital, clear and unmistakable, telling Elizabeth that I would never recover meaningfully, and they needed to act quickly to secure assets before medical bills consumed everything. The recording continued, capturing their discussion of how to transfer the house, how to take control of the business, how Elizabeth could claim medical decisions for me based on my supposedly diminished capacity. The room went deadly silent again. Sebastian's face contorted with fury and panic. Elizabeth had backed against the kitchen counter, one hand covering her mouth. Before either could speak, Brody distributed printed transcripts of similar conversations to the nearest guests, who began passing them around with expressions of growing horror. I continued calmly, explaining how I had regained consciousness faster than expected, but remained silent when I overheard their plans. How I had documented every conversation, every financial maneuver, every lie they had told about my condition. How the property transfer Elizabeth had signed was fraudulent in multiple ways that my legal team had documented exhaustively. As I spoke, I wheeled myself around the room, making eye contact with guests who stepped back to clear my path, as if my wheelchair might contaminate them. I noted familiar faces, business associates, neighbors, even Elizabeth's parents, who stood frozen in shock near the fireplace. No one interrupted me. The weight of evidence and the unexpectedness of my appearance had created a perfect vacuum for my words. When I reached Sebastian, I paused, looking up at him from my seated position with cold clarity. I gestured to Brody, who opened the briefcase and handed me the first set of documents. In the same calm voice, I informed Sebastian that as of 20 minutes ago, all company accounts had been frozen pending investigation of embezzlement. His access to business assets, client accounts, and operational systems had been terminated remotely. The evidence of his financial mismanagement had been submitted to relevant authorities, with copies sent to every major client and industry association. Next came Elizabeth's turn. I wheeled to where she stood trembling against the counter and presented the second set of documents. The invalidation of the property transfer due to fraud and coercion, copies of the restraining order preventing her from removing any items from the property, and evidence of her complicity in Sebastian's embezzlement scheme through acceptance of funds she knew were illegally obtained. Throughout all this, I maintained perfect composure, no raised voice, no visible anger, just the methodical execution of a plan, 6 months in the making. Several guests had already slipped out, unwilling to witness the destruction unfolding. Others remained frozen in morbid fascination, unable to look away from the slow-motion car crash of Sebastian and Elizabeth's lives. The next phase triggered automatically at 8 p.m. when Maya executed the financial nuclear option we had prepared. Sebastian's phone pinged with notifications, his personal accounts frozen, credit cards canceled, loan payments accelerated to immediate full repayment. The shell company I had created through Brody now owned all his debt and was calling everything due immediately. Similar notifications hit Elizabeth's phone seconds later. While they were still processing this, I played the second recording, this one from before my accident, capturing them discussing their relationship and plans for the future once they figured out how to handle the Logan situation. This evidence of their affair predating my injury demolished the last possible sympathetic interpretation of their actions as grief-driven poor judgment. Sebastian finally broke, lunging toward me with rage distorting his features. Brody stepped between us, but it wasn't necessary. 2 plainclothes officers who had been waiting outside entered at precisely that moment, responding to the pre-arranged signal from Maya that evidence of financial crimes had been formally submitted. They didn't arrest Sebastian. That would come later, after investigation, but their presence forced him to regain some semblance of control. I addressed the remaining guests one last time, apologizing for disrupting their evening, but suggesting they might want to leave as the property was now under legal dispute, and anyone remaining could be called as witnesses in upcoming proceedings. The exodus was immediate and complete. Within minutes, only Sebastian, Elizabeth, the officers, Brody, and I remained in the suddenly cavernous space. Elizabeth tried to approach me, tears streaming down her face, no doubt preparing some emotional appeal. I simply turned my chair away, directing my attention to the officers as they confirmed the property ownership situation, and advised Sebastian and Elizabeth that they should arrange to collect essential personal items only, under supervision. The final touch came as I prepared to leave. I handed Sebastian a small envelope containing a thumb drive. On it was every piece of evidence we had compiled: the recordings, the financial documentation, the falsified medical updates he had provided to clients and friends. It also contained a single note explaining that duplicate copies had been placed in secure storage with instructions for automatic distribution to law enforcement, business associates, and family members if he ever attempted to contact me or retaliate in any way. As Brody and I left, I paused in the doorway to look back at what had once been my home, now a crime scene in all but official designation. Sebastian stood in the middle of the room, the envelope crushed in his fist, face ashen with the realization that his life as he knew it was over. Elizabeth had collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at nothing, the carefully applied makeup for her perfect housewarming party streaked with tears. I felt no triumph, no joy, not even satisfaction really, just a cold sense of completion, like finishing a difficult and unpleasant task that needed to be done. The aftermath unfolded exactly as we had planned. Sebastian was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud 3 weeks later. The investigation revealed even more financial misconduct than we had documented, leading to additional charges. His professional licenses were suspended pending the outcome of his trial, effectively ending his career regardless of the legal result. Elizabeth filed for divorce almost immediately, trying to distance herself from the impending financial collapse, but our evidence of her involvement made that impossible. The courts froze her assets as well, pending determination of her complicity. The house, my house, was returned to my sole ownership through emergency court action, though I had no interest in living there again. Sebastian's parents, who had always favored him, attempted to intervene with financial support, but our preparations had anticipated this. Maya had created such a complex web of legal and financial entanglements that any funds they provided were immediately seized for restitution. They eventually gave up, unwilling to sacrifice their retirement to support a son who had committed provable fraud. Within 6 months, Sebastian had lost everything: his freedom. He was eventually sentenced to 4 years, his professional standing, his social circle, and his future prospects. Elizabeth, while avoiding jail time through a cooperation agreement, was nevertheless financially ruined, socially ostracized, and forced to move to another state to find even basic employment. As for me, I sold the house once legal ownership was restored. The money, combined with the recovered business assets and insurance settlement from my accident, provided more than enough to restart my life. I purchased a fully accessible home across town and rebuilt my company with loyal employees who had stood by me. My physical condition remains unchanged. I will never walk again. But in every other way, I am stronger than before. The accident took my legs, but Sebastian and Elizabeth's betrayal took my naivety, my tendency to trust blindly, my willingness to be overlooked. What replaced those traits is something harder, clearer, and ultimately more valuable: perfect clarity about who deserves a place in my life. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far, if complete destruction was necessary where simple justice might have sufficed. But then I remember the casual way they discussed my life while I lay supposedly unconscious, the easy dismissal of our years together, the calculated plans made over my hospital bed. And I realized that what I did wasn't revenge, it was pest control, removing dangerous parasites before they could consume anything else that belonged to me. I received a letter from Sebastian last month, sent from prison. I returned it unopened with a note reminding him of the consequences of contact. Whatever justifications or apologies he wanted to offer come far too late. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. Some wounds shouldn't heal clean. Sometimes the scar tissue needs to remain as a permanent reminder of what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, when you believe someone's silence means they can't hear you planning their destruction. The wheelchair is my constant companion now, but it's no longer my defining feature. When people see me, they don't see a victim. They see someone who rebuilt from ashes, who refused to be erased. And somewhere across the country, Sebastian and Elizabeth now live with the knowledge that they created this version of me, this unforgiving, unflinching person who waits patiently in the silence, hearing everything, forgetting nothing, and calculating the precise cost of betrayal. That awareness is the final piece of my revenge, and it will last their entire lives.